Scope creep is creepy AF. What is scope creep and how does it happen? Usually when you start a project, hopefully, you have defined some kind of a scope before you start. And usually you would have the client sign off on that scope and they'd be like,
okay, we're in agreement, this is the scope, this is what's going to be created, and
great, you start the project, everything's going fine. And then somewhere down the road, the client's like, wait,
I didn't think of this. We actually also need this. And I thought this meant that this was going to look like this and not like this. And wait, isn't this supposed to be like this company's whatever? And shouldn't it look like that?
And suddenly you're realizing that maybe the scope you defined at the beginning wasn't the same as what the client had in their mind. And you weren't actually on the same page about the scope. And that's usually when scope creep happens. Sometimes even when you define a scope with your client and you think everyone is on the same page, it doesn't necessarily mean you are. And how do you prevent this? Well, that's what I'm going to go into in this video. Firstly, let's talk about why scope creep is bad to begin with. Usually scope creep will happen when the client is inexperienced and they are booking services with you and it's the first time they're booking those kinds of services with a creative. And it's not their fault, and a lot of the times you have to do some educating there, and that's totally fine, and it's normal that clients will need some guidance from you on scope. It is just super important that you communicate boundaries before you start about how situations like that are handled. So if you communicate from the very beginning that changes in scope mean renegotiating the contract, additional costs, timeline shifts, then the client will be open to those discussions later down the road. But if you do not communicate that beforehand and then you start talking about things like this is going to cost extra, this wasn't included, then that can lead to some uncomfortable conversations and in the worst case, resentment. Scope creep isn't just bad for the relationship between you and your client and also the whole experience of the project in general. It can actually harm your business financially if it happens too often, if it happens at all, to be honest. But if it's happening a lot, then you definitely need to change something about your process and about your contracts and your boundaries. A little side quest here into a story time. When we started our studio, there were two projects we had with a similar client. Similar in terms of it was the first time they were doing a project like this. It was the first time they were booking these types of services with an outside agency. And what we found was that the scope that we had defined at the very beginning of the project was not the scope they had in mind. We thought we were on the same page, but there were things that we didn't define about, for example, what does a product page look like and what does a home page look like and what does a menu look like. For us, that was clear. We had a clear idea in our mind what that would look like, but they had other ideas, and those ideas would have been a much bigger effort than the ideas we had in our minds. And that meant that the scope in that client's eyes was bigger than in our eyes. And what did that lead to? We made a mistake by not defining that correctly to begin with. That meant we felt obligated to give them what they wanted, and it was scope creep, obviously, but it was also our fault, so I'm not even mad about it. The thing is, though, it led to the timeline shifting, which led to the project taking longer than it should have taken. It took up more resources than it should have taken, and the project budget stayed the same. So obviously, if you have a project budget going over 2 months and then it ends up being 5 months and it's that same amount of money, that's a really bad thing. It meant that whole project was a loss, and if we looked at the numbers on black and white, it was probably even in the red. It was a minus project, so minus 10 out of 10, I do not recommend it. Let's look at 5 signs that scope creep is happening. Unplanned changes. So if things start coming up during the project that were not planned for, so the client sees maybe the product and they're giving you feedback and they start making changes, and if you look back on the scope, those changes are not within that scope. I'm trying to think of an example here. Let's say the menu of a website was defined as having only top level elements. That means there's no drop down. When you hover on a menu item on desktop, it doesn't drop down. There's nothing there. You just click on it and it takes you to a link. And then the client tells you during the process, I thought this was going to have a drop down and I need sub menu items. Well, that's an unplanned change and that would be out of scope. scope. And that would be an opportunity for you to tell them this was not scoped out. That's higher level of effort, which means additional time and additional costs. Why does that need to be accounted for in the budget? Well, doing that work means additional resources, and you might not even have those resources at hand, which means you would have to get someone else to help you out. Or if you have the resources and you're willing to do the work, it still means it's going to take longer time. That's going to shift the timeline. That could bleed into other projects you have lined up. Or in the best case scenario, you have the time. It's okay if the timeline shifts, but you still need to be paid for that extra time that you are working. If you notice that the timeline is shifting because of extra feedback rounds, for example, maybe you were very lenient about the feedback, you need to go back and assess, did I really have the 2 feedback rounds that I defined in the scope originally, or did we do more like 3 feedback rounds, or was there a mini feedback round there when they sent me this email asking me for this? You need to be super aware about the feedback rounds and make sure you are being very organized and strict about that. If you've done 2 feedback rounds and that's what's defined in their scope and they want another one, you need to communicate, it's going to cost this much, it's going to take this much time, that's going to shift the timeline. So they are aware of not only it's going to cost more, but it also means that their launch of their product, whatever it is they're booking with you, is going to take longer. So how can you avoid scope creep? It's really easy to avoid if you do all the things right at the beginning of the project. You need to set clear goals with your client. So what is the goal of this project? Why is that important? Because sometimes things the client comes up with in the middle of the process are things that don't even align with the original goals. I'll give you an example. We had a client recently where the goal was they wanted people to stay on the site and discover everything there is to discover about that brand. It wasn't about conversion. It wasn't about they need to get to the product as quickly as possible, add it to cart and all those things. During the process at the very beginning where we were talking about the design strategy, there were a lot of discussions focused on things like conversion, and we were like, this isn't the project goal though. We need to make sure that the requirements, that the things that we are going to work on and that we are going to produce align with those goals. So it's really important anytime the client has feedback or anytime the client thinks they need something extra, remember to talk to them about their goals and whether that aligns with their goals and whether they need that right now or if it's something that can be added later. Set clear expectations when you start. So when you create your scope and your contract, set your boundaries not only on what is the scope and do we all agree on what the menu is going to look like, and also what do we do if that issue comes up later down the line. So let's say we do disagree on something later on, and how do we handle that? Make sure all of those discussions are had before you even start the project, and be really clear on how you handle a scope change, how you handle feedback that is given to you that calls for a change in scope, and what that means for the client in terms of the timeline and the price of the project. And another piece of advice I can give you is document everything. Document at the very beginning the requirements, have the client look at every little detail in the requirements, and by detail I mean be detailed about it. If you are talking about something like a branding and you're talking about a logo, define how many different variations of that logo there are going to be, how many different files is the client going to get at the end of that, what do those files look like, how many different formats do they get. All those things should be defined super clearly before you even start, so no extra work or no work that the client thought was going to be included that you didn't think was going to be included comes up during the process, because that's uncomfortable. If you document everything and you share that with your client, everybody's on the same page and those conversations don't typically come up. Any agreements that happen during the process, so if the client agreed to another feedback round and you tell them this is going to be billed so this much and they agree to that payment, document that somewhere in case for whatever reason they forget about it and they say we didn't approve that. Remember that these things can sometimes slip through the cracks, and if you don't document it and you're not strict about your boundaries, then you can't at the end of the project be like, oh yeah, by the way, that extra feedback round we had cost this much. If you never told them about that while it was happening, if you didn't document it clearly, if you didn't tell them I've documented this and this will be billed at the end of the project, they will feel like they've been taken advantage of, even if that wasn't your intention, just because they didn't feel like they were in the loop when it came to your decisions. Another thing that we implemented once we had more experience in terms of scope creep and process is planning for progress reviews. And they don't even have to necessarily be with the client. You could do it for yourself internally. Obviously, it's always better to include the client so everyone's on the same page. But if you have check-ins with the client, you have milestones defined, make sure you are reviewing those, because if you notice that that's shifting a lot, it could be because scope creep has been happening and things are then taking longer than they should. And be mindful that scope creep can sometimes happen without you really realizing it, because things come up where you think like, oh, that's just a small thing, I'll do that. But if it's a lot of small things, that can create bigger workload, and that can increase the level of effort, and then again increase the scope, increase the timeline, and those are things you want to avoid, or at least be paid for if they do happen. And the final piece of advice, and this is probably the most important one honestly, is learning to say no. It is okay in the middle of the process to be like, no, I cannot provide that for you. We can do it at a later date, but I can't do it right now. The client is not going to be like, okay, they can't give me what I want, so now I'm going to go to somebody else. They've already completed probably a big portion of the project with you. They're not going to jump ship and go to somebody else. They will very likely be like, okay, I understand. When do you think you will be available to provide that, and how much is it going to cost? And those are the kinds of clients you want. And honestly, if a client does not react that way, you probably shouldn't be continuing work with them after that project is done anyway. So it might be good to see that early on rather than later. But typically, honestly, ever since we started saying no to people, which we should have started doing much earlier, our mental health, our quality of life improved immensely, and our relationships to our clients improved too. Clients will also say no to you about things like your ideas and your creativity. They will have opinions and they will say, no, I don't want this. It's totally valid for you to say no when it comes to your process. And if a client is disrupting your process by adding things to the scope every other review, then you need to communicate that to them. Tell them you are going to complete the original scope. That's going to be done. And once that is finished, you can add the thing later that need to be added. Obviously, that only works with things that are digital. If it is something that is going to be printed, it is important for those things to be accounted for before the thing is printed and produced. Understandably, that process is going to look a little bit different, but it is just important to remember that boundaries are good. Clients are going to have boundaries too, and it is totally okay, and you should. It is encouraged to enforce those boundaries if you ever feel like they're being encroached upon, and it is totally okay to enforce your boundaries. Thank you for watching this video. Don't forget to leave a like and subscribe to our channel if you enjoy our content, and if you want to know more about running a creative business, be sure to check out our course, Creative Business Essentials, in the link in the description below or on our profile.